They say money can't buy love, but what about when love just shows up soaking wet at your door? Nighttime had swallowed Riverside Heights in a blanket of glistening raindrops and neon glows. On Lexington Avenue, beneath the tired, flickering light of an old street lamp, stood Owen, the delivery guy. He was soaked from head to toe, hugging a plain brown package to his chest like it held more than just another rich man's late-night craving. Owen looked up at the imposing structure of the Sterling, the tallest and arguably the most luxurious residence in the city. It loomed over him like a giant, and each time a car rushed by, a new wave of doubt seemed to wash over him. He thought about just turning back and calling it a night. Who'd notice one missed delivery? But he sighed, steeled himself, and stepped forward. The Sterling's lobby was like another planet. The soft marble floors almost seemed too clean to be real, reflecting the lights from chandeliers that could probably pay his rent for a year. The elevator ride up was smooth and silent, and as Owen looked at himself in the reflection, he had to laugh. What was a guy like him doing in a place like this? The steel doors eventually slid open, revealing the exclusive penthouse corridor. He walked the short distance to the door, lifting his hand, hesitating for just a second before knocking. The door opened almost immediately, and there was Grant Hayes, sharp-featured, eyes that could cut glass. He looked exactly as every magazine cover had portrayed him. Except, in that moment, there was something different. The sharpness softened just a little when his eyes found Owen standing there in his drenched clothes, the package barely hanging on under his arm. Well, either you are here to deliver something important, or you're trying to win some kind of wet t-shirt contest. Owen blinked, surprised. He couldn't help but chuckle, and that broke the tension that had been simmering. He passed the package to Grant, shaking his head and mumbling, "Just your usual, minus the whole contest thing. Come in, at least dry off. You're going to flood the hallway." Owen hesitated again, but then gave a nod. As he stepped inside, he tried not to let his mouth drop open. Grant handed him a clean towel, and Owen took it with a nod of thanks. "I don't bite, you know. You can relax." Grant smiled, his voice unusually soft. He gestured to the lounge, offering Owen a seat. "Thanks. See, Grant, right?" Owen replied, trying to hide his discomfort as he awkwardly patted himself dry. "That's me. And you must be Owen, the one delivery guy who actually shows up during a storm like this," Grant said, his gaze lingering on Owen's rain-soaked form with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Owen just shrugged. "Well, Bills don't really care about the weather." Owen left the Sterling, his shoes splashing against the wet pavement as he headed back down Lexington Avenue. The cold night air pressed against his skin, and despite the towel Grant had offered, he still felt the chill, perhaps not just from the rain but from the situation itself. The next morning, Owen was back in his tiny apartment over Westbury Street, the buzz of the city just outside his window. His sister, Mia, called out from the other room. She was up early, books in her arms as she prepared for her classes. "You look like you barely slept, Owen," she teased, her voice light. "Late night?" Owen shook his head, letting out a soft laugh. "Just a delivery that took a little longer than usual. Rich guy, fancy penthouse, you know the type." But even as he said the words, he knew they didn't quite fit. Grant hadn't been like the others. There was something there. Kindness, maybe even loneliness. He didn't want to dwell on it too much, but it lingered, refusing to be ignored. Later that day, Grant sat at his desk, his office at Hayes & Company reflecting the same meticulous polish as his penthouse. The view from his office was almost identical to the one from the Sterling, yet somehow it felt emptier, colder. His phone buzzed, breaking him out of his thoughts. It was a reminder. A gala happening later that week. One of those events filled with people who smiled for photographs but rarely meant it. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, the weight of expectations pressing down on him. He thought of the last time he had genuinely laughed. Last night, when Owen had been there, dripping water all over his marble floors, talking about how Bills didn't care about the weather. It had been real. And now everything else just felt like an elaborate facade. Across town, Owen was back at work, the delivery van rattling along the streets. He was good at this, keeping his head down, making his rounds, getting the job done. He didn't expect anything more. The social divide between them was obvious. The Sterling versus a cramped apartment. Designer suits versus thrift store finds. Owen knew where he stood in the grand scheme of things, and he had long since accepted it. Grant, on the other hand, found himself wondering about Owen's life, the world he came from, the people he cared about, the reasons behind that weary but hopeful smile. He wanted to know more, and that was dangerous. The night had turned even darker as the storm raged on, rain hammering against the glass walls of the Sterling like an impatient visitor. The sky was almost ink black, with flashes of lightning illuminating the sprawling skyline of Riverside Heights for just a moment, before plunging everything back into darkness. In the middle of it all, in his penthouse, Grant paced the living room, his hands tucked in the pockets of his slacks, his gaze shifting between the door and the rain-washed windows. The heavy knock on the door broke the silence, and Grant felt something inside him release, almost like a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He walked over, his footsteps muted against the polished marble floor, and pulled the door open. There stood Owen, drenched from head to toe. "I'm sorry, sir," Owen began, his voice breathless, his eyes filled with apology as he struggled to catch his breath. "The roads are flooded. Took forever to get here." Grant found himself genuinely concerned. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come in, Grant said, his voice gentler than he intended. Owen blinked, clearly surprised, but stepped inside. Grant gestured to the towel he had already set on the side table, almost as if he had known Owen would need it. You look like you could use this. Thanks. Not every day you get treated like this after showing up late, he said, the hint of sarcasm in his voice masking the vulnerability beneath. Grant shook his head, the corners of his lips twitching upwards. I'm sure you've been through worse. Besides, the storm isn't your fault. He motioned towards the lounge, and for a second, Owen hesitated before nodding and following him. So, this is how the other half lives, huh? Owen said, his eyes sweeping over the high ceilings, the sleek furniture, and the glittering city beyond the windows. It's not as glamorous as it looks, Grant replied, his voice almost wistful. Most of the time, it's just empty. Owen gave him a look, one eyebrow raised. Empty? You've got what, a fireplace, a skyline view, and probably a chef on speed dial? I'd kill for just the view. Well, the view's not everything, Grant said quietly, his eyes shifting to the window where the rain streaked down in sheets. Then, Grant broke the quiet, a hint of a smile curling his lips as he looked back at Owen. So, what's the weirdest thing you've ever had to deliver? Oh man, where do I start? There was this one time a guy ordered 1,000 rubber ducks. Like, not joking. 1,000. I had to ask him if he was planning on opening a bath-themed nightclub or something. Grant laughed. Rubber ducks, huh? Grant shook his head, still smiling. You don't get that in the corporate world, just a lot of paperwork, and people who think they're more important than they are. Hey, I'll trade you, Owen said, grinning. You can have the delivery van and the rubber ducks, and I'll take the penthouse and the paperwork. He paused for a second, looking around again. Although, to be fair, I'd probably spend the whole time just staring out the window. Grant looked at him, something softening in his gaze. There was a simplicity to Owen's words, a sort of longing that wasn't wrapped in envy, but in genuine appreciation. For the first time, Grant realized how far removed his life had been from anything truly real. You know, Grant said slowly, his voice thoughtful, I think you're the first person who's ever said they'd trade places with me. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it, maybe because it was true. Owen looked at him. Yeah, well, I guess it's easy to think the grass is greener when you're on the outside looking in, he shrugged, his eyes meeting Grant's, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding. An unspoken truth that neither of them knew how to put into words. The storm had long since passed, but something had changed for both Owen and Grant. Every few days, Owen would make his way to the gleaming building, the kind of building that symbolized everything he didn't have, and every time he walked into the towering lobby of Hayes & Company, it felt a little less intimidating. It was a strange kind of friendship, one formed in those few fleeting moments between deliveries, amidst the steady hum of an office filled with important meetings and phone calls. But for both of them, those moments were different. The invitation had come suddenly. Grant had walked up to Owen at Hayes & Company, a slight nervousness in his voice that seemed so unlike him. He'd mentioned a gala, a corporate event for investors and partners, one of those events where people wore expensive suits and exchanged insincere smiles. He had said it in a way that was almost casual, like it wasn't a big deal. But Owen could hear the underlying hope in his voice. You should come. It could be fun, Grant had said, his eyes searching Owen's, waiting for his response. Owen had hesitated, his gut reaction being to say no. He couldn't bring himself to say no outright. The way Grant had looked at him, it was almost as if he needed Owen there, and so, against his better judgment, he agreed. The night of the gala came sooner than Owen expected, and he found himself standing in front of his mirror, feeling more out of place than ever. When he arrived at the grand atrium, the event hall rented out for the night, it was like stepping into another world. He stood at the entrance for a moment, taking it all in, feeling the weight of his own presence. Owen scanned the room, searching for Grant, hoping to find a familiar face among the sea of strangers, and then, there he was, standing by one of the tall tables. He excused himself from the group and made his way over, his gaze never leaving Owen. You made it, Grant said, his voice warm, almost relieved. Yeah, I guess I did. This place is something else. He glanced around, the opulence of it all almost overwhelming. The people, the lights, the glamour. It was too much. Grant must have noticed the tension in Owen's posture, because he reached out, his hand resting lightly on Owen's arm. Hey, it's just a party. Stick with me, okay? You'll be fine. As the night wore on, Grant did his best to keep Owen close, introducing him to people, making sure he wasn't left standing alone. But it was impossible to ignore the curious glances, the raised eyebrows when people realized who Owen was. The unease in Owen's chest grew, a gnawing feeling that only seemed to worsen as the minutes ticked by. Grant, for his part, tried to keep things light, leaning in to whisper a joke in Owen's ear whenever he could, trying to make him laugh, trying to make him forget about the strangeness of it all. But it didn't last. They had been standing near the bar when it happened. One of Grant's colleagues, a tall man in an immaculate suit, his voice loud enough to carry over the music. He was talking to someone else, his laughter echoing through the space. I mean, really, Grant's always had a soft spot for the underdogs, hasn't he? It's almost charming, the way he brings in these lower-class types. Makes him look benevolent. Owen froze, the words cutting through the noise of the party, each one landing like a blow. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the embarrassment, the anger, all of it mixing together into something that made it hard to breathe. Grant noticed immediately, his eyes snapping to Owen, his smile fading as he saw the change in his expression. "Owen?" he said, his voice laced with concern. He reached out, but Owen stepped back, shaking his head. "No, Grant, it's fine," Owen muttered. "Owen, please," Grant started, but Owen cut him off, his voice sharper than he intended. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he turned, pushing his way through the crowd. He could hear Grant calling after him, but he didn't stop. Grant stood there for a moment, watching as Owen disappeared into the crowd, his own heart sinking. He finally caught sight of Owen near the exit, his hand on the door ready to leave. "Owen, wait!" Grant called, his voice carrying across the room. "Owen, please, just let's talk," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. Owen shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Talk about what, Grant? About how I don't belong here? About how I'm just some delivery guy who doesn't fit into your perfect little world?" His voice cracked, and he hated it. Hated the way it betrayed how much this hurt. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Grant's. "You belong here, Grant. I don't. I'm just the delivery guy." "Owen, no. You're not just... You're more than that. To me, you're..." But the words caught in his throat and he couldn't finish. He didn't know how to make Owen understand. "You don't get it, Grant. You can't. We're just different." And with that, he turned, pushing the door open, the cold night air rushing in as he stepped out, leaving Grant standing there, his hand still outstretched, his heart feeling heavier than it ever had. The rain had finally cleared, leaving Riverside Heights bathed in the soft glow of a rare winter sun. It was mid-morning when Grant found himself standing outside Cafe Linden, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a modest place, nothing like the upscale restaurants he was used to. It was Owen's place, a small, cozy corner cafe that smelled of fresh coffee and warmth. He stood there for a moment, staring through the window, his eyes searching for the one person he had come for. And there he was, Owen, sitting at his usual table. Grant took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed the door open. Slowly, Grant made his way over to the table, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He stopped just beside Owen, his shadow falling over the table, and Owen looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as they met Grant's. "Can I sit?" "Owen," Grant began, his voice rough with emotion. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything that happened at the gala, for the things that were said, for the way it made you feel." He paused, his eyes searching Owen's, hoping, praying, that he could somehow make him understand. "You didn't deserve that. You deserve so much better than that." "Grant, it's not just about what they said," he replied, his voice shaky. "It's about everything. It's about who we are, where we come from. It's about the fact that no matter how much we try, there's always going to be this gap between us. And I don't know if I can keep pretending it doesn't matter." Grant swallowed hard, his chest tightening at Owen's words. "Owen," he said softly, his voice filled with a kind of raw honesty that made his throat ache. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything. My business, my image, my life. I've always known how to make things work, how to make people see what I wanted them to see. But the one thing I can't control, the one thing I can't seem to get right, is how I feel about you." He paused, his gaze holding Owen's, the sincerity in his eyes impossible to miss. "I don't care what anyone thinks, Owen. I don't care about their opinions, their judgments. The only thing that matters to me is you. I want you. I want this, whatever it is that we have. I don't know where it's going to take us, but I know that I want to find out, and I don't want to do it alone." Owen's eyes filled with tears, his breath catching in his throat as he listened to Grant's words. "But what if it doesn't work?" Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes searched Grant's, filled with doubt, with fear. "We're from such different worlds. What if it just doesn't work?" He took a deep breath, his eyes softening, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "Then we'll make a world of our own," he said, his voice steady, filled with a quiet kind of determination. "We'll figure it out together, because I can't just let you go, Owen. I can't walk away from this, from us. Not without trying." The words hung between them, heavy and real, and Owen felt the tears slip down his cheeks. Slowly he nodded, his voice breaking. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, Grant." Grant reached up, his hand cupping the side of Owen's face, his thumb brushing away the tear that had slipped down his cheek. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them filled with longing, with hope, with everything they hadn't been able to say. Slowly, Grant leaned in, his forehead resting against Owen's, their eyes closing as they breathed each other in. The moment stretched on, filled with hesitation, with the fear of what came next. But then, slowly, Grant tilted his head, his lips brushing against Owen's, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of everything they had felt, everything they had wanted but hadn't dared to ask for. Owen's breath hitched, his hands coming up to rest on Grant's shoulders, his fingers curling into the fabric of his coat as he leaned into the kiss, his heart pounding in his chest. The kiss deepened, their lips moving together in a way that felt natural, inevitable, like they had always been meant to find each other. It was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid to break whatever fragile thing had grown between them. But then, slowly, the kiss grew, filled with the need that had been building between them for so long, the desperation to hold on to something real, something that mattered. The cafe seemed to fade away, the soft murmur of other patrons, the clinking of cups and saucers, the quiet hum of conversation. All of it disappeared, leaving just the two of them, lost in each other. Grant's hand moved to the back of Owen's neck, holding him close, and Owen melted into the touch, his heart pounding with a kind of joy he hadn't known he could feel. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless, their foreheads still resting against each other, their eyes closed, their hands still holding on like they were afraid to let go. "I'm not letting you go," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion, his thumb brushing against Owen's cheek. "No matter what it takes, I'm not letting you go." Owen looked at him, his eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, his voice breaking as he whispered back, "I don't want you to." 2 days had passed since that first kiss at Cafe Linden, but it felt like an eternity for Grant and Owen. Owen found himself standing in front of Grant's penthouse door once again. He knocked gently, barely a sound, but the door swung open almost immediately, revealing Grant, his eyes lighting up at the sight of Owen. "I'm glad you came," Grant said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching Owen's face. For a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them, filled with everything they wanted to say, but couldn't quite find the words for. Then Grant stepped closer, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing against Owen's cheek, his touch gentle, almost reverent. He could feel the warmth of Owen's skin, the way his breath hitched just slightly at the contact, and it made something inside him swell, something that felt almost like hope. Slowly, Grant leaned in, his forehead resting against Owen's, their eyes closing, their breaths mingling in the quiet. It was a moment of stillness, a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with the anticipation of what came next. Grant's hand moved to the back of Owen's neck, his fingers curling into his hair, and he tilted his head, his lips finding Owen's, soft at first, a gentle exploration, as if asking permission. Owen sighed into the kiss, his hands coming up to rest against Grant's chest. Feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his fingers, he leaned into the kiss, deepening it, his body pressing closer, needing to feel Grant, to hold him, to know that this was real. The kiss grew, filled with everything they had kept hidden for so long, the longing, the need, the hope. They broke apart, their foreheads still touching, their breaths coming in short, shaky bursts, both of them trying to steady themselves. Grant looked at Owen, his eyes filled with emotion, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay with me tonight," he said, the words falling from his lips, raw, honest, filled with a kind of vulnerability that made his throat tighten. He nodded, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Okay." It was just one word, but it held so much. Hope, fear, love. Grant's hands moved to the hem of Owen's shirt, his fingers trembling just slightly as he pulled it up, his eyes searching Owen's, asking for permission. Owen nodded, his own hands moving to the buttons of Grant's shirt, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they were trying to savor every second, every touch. They kissed again, deeper this time, filled with a kind of need that they couldn't hold back anymore. Grant looked down at Owen, his hand brushing against his cheek, his eyes filled with emotion. "You belong here," he whispered, his voice filled with a kind of quiet determination that made Owen's heart swell. "Right here, with me, and I'm never letting you go." Owen looked at him, his eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, his voice breaking as he whispered back, "I'm not going anywhere." A week had passed since that night in Grant's penthouse, a week that had been filled with moments Owen never thought he'd experience. Waking up in Grant's arms, the way the sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bathing them in a warm glow as they whispered to each other, laughed together, shared their fears, their hopes. It had been a week of vulnerability, of letting down their guards, of feeling that maybe, just maybe, this could work. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Owen whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with a kind of uncertainty that made Grant's heart ache. "Every day," he admitted, his voice soft, filled with honesty. "I think about it all the time, Owen, about us, about what this could be, and I know it won't be easy. I know there will be challenges, people who won't understand, things that will try to pull us apart." He turned fully, facing Owen now, his hands moving to cup his face, his eyes searching Owen's. "But I also know that I want this. I want you. I don't care about the challenges or the differences. We'll figure it out. We'll navigate it together, one step at a time. Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together." Do you think Owen and Grant can overcome their differences and make it work? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Relationships are never easy, but sometimes they're worth the fight. What do you think? Subscribe to see what happens next in their journey and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss it. Their journey is only just beginning, and sometimes the best parts are the ones we haven't seen yet. This is Pride Stories Unfiltered, We are here for you every day as one big Pride family. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button.